had my first running with the oppressive Catholic hierarchy when I'd been away for a while. I left Nigeria when I was 19 to come to the US to go to college. Actually, I left Nigeria because I was supposed to be a doctor, and after 1 year of medicine, I fled. So the US was sort of my savior. So I came to the US and just all I wanted was to do anything that was not a science because I was so sick of the sciences. And so I was in the US for a few years before I went back home to see my parents, and I realized the church had really changed. So there were men sort of positioned at the entrance of the church, and their job was to examine what women were wearing. And so for the sin of exposing your arm, you could be sent out unless you got a shawl. And actually, there were people who had extra shawls to hand to women so they could wrap themselves up. And I was just horrified by this. And so I wrote about it. And I wrote about it thinking, I'm speaking up for the masses. This is wrong. Women are being harassed in church. Sometimes a woman would go to receive communion, and the priest would look at her and be like, that top is sleeveless. You can't get communion. Go back. Yeah. People would complain about it quietly. And so when I wrote about it, I thought, right now we can rise up and say no. But no. People actually said, why did you write about it? You should keep it quiet. You shouldn't let people know what's going on. And then, but that passed. But the more, I think, consequential was after my father died, to have a funeral, that's when I really started to realize the depth of just, I think, the rot. Just the idea that in order to get a priest to come and bury your parent, you're expected to pay all kinds of things. I mean, they just make all kinds of demands on you. And then I started to hear other stories from people that just felt so just utterly unchristian. Yeah. Families who would say, the priest, on the day of the funeral, the priest said, we owe 10,000 naira more, so he's not coming. But by the way, the coffin is already out there. That kind of thing. Yeah. And I was horrified by it. Yeah. So my fiction writing is really in many ways completely disconnected from anything. It's sort of me floating in the air and being suspended. But the other side, which is the citizen side of me, is that I exist in a perpetual state of rage. It's true. And that I do not want to stop existing in that state of rage. Because I think it's what keeps me from sort of succumbing to despair. I can't afford despair. I have to believe that there is hope for Nigeria. I mean, there are many other things I'm enraged about. Let's not get started about women in the world. But what's happening in Nigeria is quite simple. We had an election in February that was deeply flawed. And we have a person who we've been told is a winner who did not win the election. And, and this has been shown over and over. There's evidence for this. I think that we have a generation of young people who are increasingly disillusioned because they had such faith in this past election. And so for me, it's simply that I am enraged, but also that I am not letting go of hope.
I'm Beza. I've read your books at different points in my life. I grew up in Ethiopia my whole entire life and came here for college to seek education like you've done. I grew up in a house where my dad told me not to study my first language and learn English because that is the language that will help me cross the ocean. And with that reality, I've come here and I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot from your books. And I feel this weight that whatever I'm doing here is never going to be enough for Africa because there's just so much pain that is happening there that I don't even understand, me just as a person who's coming from East Africa, that's happening in Central Africa and West Africa and so on. I study computer science, which is a field that if I go back and work right now, won't do much in any way. So basically my question is, I mean, right now at this stage, you have the voice to make maybe slight changes, but back when you were in my stage, how did you dare to dream? How do you dream about affecting change for something that you love, something that made you you? So that's my question.
Thank you for your question. The fact that you asked the question says a lot because you are dreaming. When I was an undergrad, Yeah, that's actually a good question. Did I? I don't think I had sort of grandiose ideas of going to save Africa, honestly. I, I think I just wanted to write fiction. And I was just hoping somebody would bloody publish my book, honestly. But really, what I'm hearing and what I want to kind of address in your question is this idea that one has to do everything. You don't have to. You don't have to beat yourself up because you don't know what's happening in Central Africa. You do care. At least you know, maybe you know what's happening in one tiny part of Ethiopia, and I think that's enough. There's something maybe about the generation of young people today who think that they need to have it all figured out, they need to know everything. You don't. In the end, what matters the most is a kind of purity of intention. You know, you care, your heart is in the right place, you will figure it out. And I don't agree, by the way, that what you're studying will not be useful in Ethiopia. I think that there's a lot you could do as a computer science major. I also think that it helps to sort of accumulate not just work experience, but a certain kind of social capital before you go back. Because, you know, in Ethiopia, if you go back and you're like, oh, I've just come from Princeton, I have this program there, they'll be like, okay, what can we do? We know that, we know Africa, so let's not even deny it. So really, I think you're on the right path. So in Nigeria, when events happen and when there's a big woman or a big man, people say, we want to recognize the presence of... So I'm going to ask you to let me be very Nigerian today and say that I want to recognize the presence of a man I deeply respect and a man who I think is a beacon of hope, not just for Nigeria, but for Africa. And he's the man who many of us know won the elections in Nigeria. He's here with us, Mr. Peter Obi. I just want to let you all know that he's going to tell me off for doing this because he didn't want it to be known. And he is also an example of that very rare quality in politicians, which is genuine humility.
Yes.
My name is Persis, and my question for you today is surrounding faith and culture. And so you spoke about the Roman Catholic culture in Nigeria, how problematic it was, but then also like connecting faith to fiction or the spiritual practices in your village growing up. And so I wanted to ask, like, as you became an adult, like separating yourself from the Catholic religion, have you gone back to like the Bible or Christian tradition to try and work out your faith for yourself? And for like Africans whom have like spiritual traditions, but are also like working with like problematic colonial tradition like Christianity, do you have any advice for working through that?
Wow. I haven't entirely abandoned Catholicism. For people who have been raised Catholic, it's really interesting how it's almost impossible. You know, even when you reject it, even the rejection of it, and it's intensely Catholic. I mean, you reject the Catholic Church in a way that's intensely Catholic. So that it's really difficult. And I have to confess that I was so thoroughly immersed in Catholicism that for me, I just find it difficult to take seriously any other kind of Christian denomination. This is also part of the arrogance of Catholicism. And so I'm interested in faith, and in general, I really do think increasingly that it's possible that faith can be disengaged from religion, or at least from organized religion. But I also respect and understand the fact that our continent is intensely religious. You cannot effect change on the continent of Africa without engaging with religion, especially Christianity and Islam. It's up to your generation to start to change things for the better. I mean, we can practice a Christianity that is more respectful of who we are. We can practice a Christianity that is less focused on money, because that, in fact, I think is the bane of African Christianity, this kind of crazed prosperity preaching. And there are people who've said, oh, it's because Africans are poor. I don't think so. I think it's because people have chosen to value certain things and not value others. And we can change that, and, faith can be a good thing, I guess. When people have said, you shouldn't talk about feminism and women's equality because not only is it against our culture, it's also against Christianity. To which I then say, go read about Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
The Christians here will understand. So.
My name is Rodolfo Okonkwo. I'm so glad I'm here. I thank you for the wonderful lecture you gave. I teach Americana, and my students always wonder about Ifemelu. I know you've had this question many times. How much of Ifemelu were you struggling to make Ifemelu not to be you? And how much of her is in you? Or how much of you is in her? And the other one is, what happened to the TV show? The HBO was supposed to do a series on Americana. We are looking forward to that. What happened to that project? Thank you.
But I have to start by registering my discontent at this excitement around dramatizations of novels. And I understand that it's the norm, but it really can be annoying when people say, congratulations, your book is going to be made into a movie. And I'm thinking it's the book that matters, you know? Why? I want the world to be more excited by books. But anyway, if Emily is more interesting than I am, is what I can tell you. A very dear friend of mine said to me, you made yourself and took out all your warmth. Femele, in many ways, is a character I like very much, but I think she's also in some ways an experiment in that idea of the female character who does not practice likability. Because I think in so much of literature, there's an expectation that the female characters, they're read differently, that you know, they should be likable. And when they're not, I think the judgment can be really harsh and extreme. And so I think in some ways, Ifemelu is an experiment in sort of, can we see if we can maybe be okay with her, even though she doesn't quite do likability? Maybe, I don't know. So I don't know the answer to your question.
Thank you very much for your lecture, Chimamanda. I wanted to ask about your character, Melaitus in Half of a Yellow Sun. Ugu, who Melaitus was based on. I know in Africa, like, the houseboy experience varies a lot across different households. But what was your experience growing up with Melaitus, and have you seen him since the publication of your novel?
Thank you, I love that question. So you've actually really read the book. And you also read the dedication. Thank you. That's really the best thing a writer wants is to be read well. Actually, by the time I was born, he left, so the war ended in 1970, I was born in 1977, and he left at the end of the war, my mother says, and just didn't come back. I heard about him because my mother would constantly talk about him and how good he had been, how helpful, because he became the house help in Nsukka before the war started, and so when they ran, he ran with them. He sort of went with them. But often when I would hear stories about him, I would wonder what it was like for him, right? So I thought he was helpful to my mother. I wonder what he thought. I would sometimes think, I wonder if sometimes he, was irritated or thought my mother was, horrible or something. And so I started to imagine Ubu. And of course, growing up, as most middle-class families on the continent, we had house helps, all the time. One of the things I think I admired and respected about my mother was how the humanity of people who worked for her was important to her. And it wasn't really common, So I think maybe because I was raised with house helps that, we were raised to know we're full human beings like us, it was maybe possible for me to try and imagine the life of a house help, and also to to tell the house help story with agency, because I think class is something that we very often don't really engage with. I mean, we talk about religion, we talk about tribe, but class, I think, is really, really central. Ubu is my take on him, but also I think Ubu is me. So my brother here who asked about Ifemelu, it's interesting that nobody asks me how much of me is in Ubu, but there's a lot of me in Ubu. Inside.
My name is Ella Bwanya. I'm from Kenya.
I just want to first off start off by thanking you for your presence on this campus, for gracing us with your presence, and giving us a beautiful example of African excellence. I think that's something that I have greatly... It's such an honor and a pleasure. I was just telling my mom, and she was like, what? Chimamanda? I was like, she's in Kenya. She's like, what? I'm like, yeah, are you sure? Anyway, that's not my question. I'm also a writer, but I've been always very scared to share my work. I've written a lot of works on victims of war, victims of genocide, particularly in the African continent. I only write about African stories, but I've never experienced any of these events myself. So my question for you as a writer, how do you access the life of the characters that you write about, even though there may be instances where you have not lived the lives that they live? How do you access their lives and develop their stories?
I think I'm a very good listener. I really listen. And I'm a watcher. And I watch things. Also, I'm a very good eavesdropper, which is an essential skill if you're going to tell stories, but I think maybe it's also just that I like people, and I think I understand people. And so it makes it possible for me to kind of sort of imaginatively live someone's life. So while you're talking, I'm kind of inventing a life for you. And I think I might be 50% right if I told you what I think your life is. I might be. I mean, I'm kind of good at that sort of thing. And but I think it's also that I always start out with characters thinking of them as human beings, by which I mean thinking of them as both flawed, but also as sort of having the capability of magnificence, you know. I mean, I wrote a story about Mr. Trump's wife, and I'm not in any way a supporter or admirer of the Trumps. But the New York Times had asked me if I wanted to write a short story about the elections, and it seemed the most unlikely choice, but I kind of wanted to give myself that challenge. And so I went and I did a bit of research about her background, and I wrote a story that people are still telling me that they think I knew her or knew someone who knew her, and I didn't. So I guess I haven't answered your question. So I would just say to you, keep trying. And the other thing is the details matter. It's really important, if possible, stay away from abstractions and focus on significant detail. That always works better.
Do you feel like there's a duty for you to liberate them in your writing? Because as I read your writing, it's almost as though you were liberating people who had no voice for themselves.
I love that reading. I'll take it. Thank you.
My name is Eku Promise, and I'm a Nigerian, also a grad student in computer science. So, like, you mentioned something I could really relate to, which is like in your secondary or primary education, like curiosity was not really like rewarded. Like you were seeing, like you got some like funny comments and stuff like that. So my question is like, how do we like from an early stage, like primary school, secondary school, encourage curiosity in the classrooms in Nigeria? Like, get kids to be like, feel free to like say their mind, even though it's not like in line with what the teacher is thinks they should be thinking.
I think the first thing would be to stop making tests be about how much you've crammed the textbook, you know. And also, we really need to change teacher training colleges, the curriculum in those places, because the teachers are only giving as much as they were given. And, you know, my daughter did a year of, my daughter did nursery school in Lagos, and I was just struck by her coming back with reams of notes. You know, she was like 4.5. And I'm like, what is this? I think many of us know parents who are happy to spend money on what they recognize as textbooks, but what they call storybook, they will not spend money on it because they think it's a waste of time. Actually, I think the reverse should be the case. Because, you know, if children read imaginative writing, there's just so much it does for them. So I think the one thing I would change is I would do a lot more storybook in schools. Actually, I remember reading something about Government College Umuahia, speaking of Chinua Achebe's, and I don't know whose memoir it was, but how they had this English teacher who every day they had to read a novel, every single day in school. And no wonder the graduates of that school are all sort of established. And so I think a lot more imaginative writing. And we need to, in Nigeria, for teachers, start to think of respect as being something very different from fear. You know, that idea that if a child is suitably afraid, then that means that child is respectful. That's not true at all. That's not true. And I think there's a lot of that that's ingrained in us culturally. And I think it's worth changing. Are you thinking about teaching? So go and change it. Go and change it for us, please. Please. Because there's so much intelligence in those kids, but you find that a lot of it is squashed. You know, you cram the textbook, and if you write something that's not in the textbook, even if it's thoughtful, go change it for us.
I'm a king, yes, I'm a king, I think I'm a king,